April 9, 1942. The road from Miraflores to San Fernando was a trail of heat and dust, an endless column of men stripped of rank, of hope, of water. The sun hung low and merciless, hammering down on 70,000 Allied prisoners, who shuffled forward under Japanese rifles. Each step was survival. Each collapse meant death. Boots scraped against gravel, flies gathered over bodies left behind. And somewhere in that long, broken line was a 17-year-old farm boy named Glenn Frazier. His face blistered, his lips cracked, his heart burning with a single thought: live long enough to take revenge. U.S. Army After Action Report, April 1942. The Japanese called it a transfer. The Americans called it what it was: the Death March. 6 days, 7 nights, no food, no mercy, and almost no sleep. Prisoners who stumbled were bayoneted. Those who begged for water were shot. Others drank from ditches tainted with blood and gasoline. U.S. War Crimes Tribunal, 1946. Yet even as men fell beside him, Frazier's hatred refused to die. He whispered through clenched teeth, "I'll see this through, then I'll see them pay." 10 hours earlier, Japan's 14th Army had broken through the last line of defense on the Bataan Peninsula. Major General Edward King Jr., outnumbered and surrounded, had surrendered his exhausted men, nearly 76,000 Americans and Filipinos, to Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa. The decision saved lives, but it sealed their fate. Bureau of Pacific Operations, 1942. In those first moments of captivity, the young farm boy from Alabama realized that the real war was only beginning. The rifles pointed at them weren't just enforcing control, they were enforcing humiliation. Captured men were forced to discard helmets, canteens, and boots. The guards laughed as they poured precious water into the dirt, daring the prisoners to lick it from the mud. Eyewitness account, 1945. The march north became a theater of cruelty. The sick and wounded were executed along the roadside. Trucks filled with bodies rolled by like ghostly processions of a defeated army. The smell of decay clung to the humid air. Even the locals, silent behind bamboo fences, could not look for long. When Frazier reached Camp O'Donnell, he had lost a third of his body weight. The camp was a skeleton of barbed wire and bamboo huts, an open grave disguised as a prison. Philippine Commonwealth Archives, 1942. Men died faster than they could be buried. Dysentery and malaria took hundreds daily. It wasn't the war anymore, one survivor would later recall. It was a slow-motion dying. But somewhere amid that nightmare, something inside Glenn hardened into purpose. The desire for vengeance, raw, primal, and blinding, became his shield. When rations were cut again, he rationed his own fury instead. When guards beat prisoners for amusement, he memorized their faces. And when a friend was executed for stealing rice, he whispered a promise that one day, the empire that had taken everything from him would pay for every drop of blood spilled under its flag. Months passed, and the war outside the fences shifted. The Japanese tide was at its high water mark. Java, Singapore, and Burma had fallen. Tokyo's radio boasted of a new order across Asia. Yet in the shadows of Osaka and Tokyo, another story was unfolding, one written in the dark corners of prison camps where Allied captives toiled as slaves in mines and factories. By October 1942, Glenn Frazier was one of them. Transferred across the East China Sea in a rusted transport, later nicknamed a hell ship, he arrived in Osaka under freezing winds and the smell of burning coal. The guards shouted orders in clipped Japanese, and the prisoners were herded through city streets like cattle. Civilians stared, some curious, others afraid to look too long. Osaka Civil Prefecture Log, 1942. His new home was a lumber yard on the edge of the city, where men worked 10-hour shifts hauling timber in sub-zero temperatures. Gloves were forbidden. Meals were a few spoonfuls of rice and watery soup. The guards demanded obedience not through words but through fists and bamboo rods. One misstep meant punishment. One wrong glance could mean execution. That winter, it was 8 degrees Fahrenheit when Frazier, half-starved and shivering, shoved his hands into his pockets for warmth. A guard noticed. That small, instinctive act, human, desperate, was seen as defiance. Within an hour, he stood before a Japanese major in the camp's courtyard. The officer's voice was calm, cold, precise. "All soldiers obey orders," he said through an interpreter. Frazier's reply came from somewhere deeper than fear. "I'm not a soldier, I'm a prisoner of war." The major slammed his fist on the desk, veins bulging. "Take him outside," he ordered. "We'll make an example of him." In front of the entire camp, the officer drew his sword, a gleaming arc of steel that caught the pale winter sun. The blade hovered inches from Frazier's neck. He was asked for final words. What came out wasn't planned, it was pure defiance. "He can kill me," Frazier said, "but he cannot kill my spirit, and my spirit will haunt him until he dies." The major hesitated. To Westerners, it was a bold speech. To the Japanese officer steeped in centuries of superstition, it was an omen. Instead of executing him, he ordered Frazier into solitary confinement. The cell was no more than a pit in the ground, 5 feet wide, 5 feet deep, 5 feet across. No light, no sound, just cold dirt and the smell of rot. For 7 days and nights he was left there to unravel. Hunger blurred into fever dreams. His ribs ached from beatings, his thoughts fractured into flashes of faces, his mother, his farm, his lost friends on the road to O'Donnell. When the hatch finally opened, the sunlight stabbed his eyes like knives. He couldn't stand. When he reached for help, the guard stomped his fingers, then struck him across the skull with a rifle butt. 3 ribs broke. Blood filled his mouth. Medical log. Osaka Camp, 1942. The Japanese guards didn't understand it, but their cruelty had failed to break something they couldn't touch. Every day after that, Glenn's hatred grew heavier, sharper, more focused. It was no longer just anger. It was a plan forming in silence. He began watching the guards, noting routines, memorizing weaknesses. He learned which officers smoked alone by the yard gate, which shifts were drunk by dusk, and how far it was from the lumber yard to the train line that vanished into the mountains. U.S. POW debriefing, 1945. And then came the air raids, tiny reminders that somewhere, far beyond those prison walls, the war was turning. Allied bombers were appearing over Japanese skies. The empire that had once seemed invincible was starting to shake. The guards whispered about lost ships, about hunger back home. That was when Glenn made his vow, not to escape, at least, not yet, but to outlast them, to survive long enough for the war itself to deliver the revenge he couldn't take with his own hands. And as the thunder of distant bombs echoed over Osaka, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Cold, dangerous hope. Because somewhere beyond that horizon, the tide was rising. And his captors had no idea that the prisoner they thought broken was about to become the witness to their empire's fall. By 1943, Japan's empire stretched across nearly 1/6 of the planet. Yet inside its heart, in the smoky factories of Osaka, the rhythm of war was changing. The thunder of Allied bombers was no longer distant. It was near, almost daily. Sirens howled across the harbor as Fraser and hundreds of prisoners ducked beneath timber piles, praying the walls wouldn't collapse. The Japanese guards barked orders, trying to project authority, but even their eyes betrayed fatigue. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Fraser, his ribs still healing from the solitary pit, understood what was coming before they did. He'd seen it in their rations, rice portions shrinking, cigarettes gone, uniforms threadbare. Japan's once mighty supply lines were crumbling. Allied submarines prowled the Pacific, cutting off the fuel and steel that fed the war machine. Combined Fleet Logistics Report, 1944. The Tim-en Fenno Roding-Think. The empire that had enslaved him was starving, and so was he. Every night, in the lumberyard barracks, the men whispered of home. They spoke of American ships that might one day anchor in Tokyo Bay, of bombers that might shatter Japan's factories into dust. Hope was dangerous, punishable if overheard, but necessary. Fraser kept his voice low, his hatred quiet. His plan wasn't a cinematic escape, it was endurance. To survive long enough for revenge meant mastering patience. The secret advantage that was turning the tide of war didn't come from brute strength. It came from the quiet minds behind the factories Fraser could only imagine. Men like Henry Kaiser, William Knudsen, and Charles Sorensen, who had transformed Detroit into the arsenal of democracy. Office of War Production, 1943. In 1 year, the United States produced over 86,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and nearly 50,000 jeeps. Every minute, a bullet, a shell, or a plane wing was rolling off an assembly line somewhere. Even across the ocean, Fraser could sense this invisible current of steel and fire building in his favor. When American B-29 superfortresses first appeared over Osaka, the prisoners risked glimpses through cracks in the fence. The aircraft were massive, their contrails slicing the sky at 30,000 feet. To the Japanese, they were ghosts, untouchable, unseen until the bombs fell. To the prisoners, they were proof that the world still remembered them. The B-29 was unlike anything Japan could counter. 4 Wright R-3350 engines gave it the range to cross the Pacific. Each could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, guided by a Norden bomb sight so precise that engineers bragged it could hit a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Technical Manual TM-1275 1944. When Osaka's industrial district burned in March 1945, the sky turned orange, and the ash that fell on the lumberyard was mixed with the fragments of the empire's pride. The prisoners weren't safe from these raids, far from it. Fraser remembered one day when 2 Japanese Zero fighters dove low, strafing a hospital filled with Allied wounded. The explosions tore through the building. They hit the hospital, he would later say, and when I looked for my friend I found only his left foot in his shoe. For Fraser, this was no longer just war. It was personal reckoning, paid in blood on both sides. But in that same moment of horror, he realized something profound. Japan was lashing out in desperation. The Zeros that once ruled the Pacific were now outdated, outgunned, and outnumbered. American Hellcats, Wildcats, and Corsairs had closed the technological gap. The once feared Mitsubishi A6M0, with its paper-thin armor and 20mm cannons, could no longer keep pace. Imperial Japanese Navy Pilot Debrief, 1945. Fraser didn't know the engineering names, Pratt & Whitney, Grumman, General Electric, But he could see the result: fewer planes returning to base, guards whispering about Tokyo burns. Even through his chains, he was witnessing the unraveling of an empire built on arrogance. That arrogance had started years earlier, in the boardrooms of Tokyo's Ministry of War. Japan's leaders believed their Bushido spirit, discipline, loyalty, sacrifice, could outweigh America's machines. But factories do not tire. Assembly lines do not feel hunger. When American industry finally awoke, it unleashed something even the most loyal soldier could not match: scale. War Production Board Memorandum, 1943. In Osaka, the shift was visible even to a prisoner. One day, shipments of lumber ceased entirely. Another, the guards ordered the men to dig trenches around the yard, air raid defenses. Japan was no longer expanding. It was fortifying. Its empire had begun to feed on itself. Japanese Army Engineering Corps log, Feb 1945. Then came the raid that Fraser would never forget. The night Osaka itself became a furnace. March 13, 1945. Just before midnight, air raid sirens wailed. From the western horizon came the hum, low rising of hundreds of B-29 engines. U.S. Army Air Force's mission record, 1945. When the first wave reached the city, the bomb bays opened in perfect synchronization. Fraser, trapped beneath the timber shed, could see the horizon flicker. Within minutes, Osaka's industrial heart was ablaze. Flames leapt 100 feet into the air, feeding on the wooden homes packed tightly along the canals. Smoke blotted out the moon. The heat was so intense that the paint bubbled off steel rails, and the air itself seemed to scream. Japanese Civil Defense Report, 19. The guards who once struck prisoners with impunity were now terrified, diving into shelters, their shouts lost beneath the roar of collapsing buildings. For the first time, the captors and the captives shared the same fear. One prisoner described the moment as the earth itself taking revenge. Survivor testimony, 1946. By dawn, 30 square miles of Osaka lay in ruins. Over 10,000 civilians were dead, and Japan's war industry had been shattered beyond repair. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Yet among the rubble, Fraser stood trembling, not from fear, but from realization. The revenge he had dreamed of for 4 years had arrived not from his hands, but from the sky. Still, even victory looked like hell. The smell of charred wood and flesh hung over the city for weeks. The prisoners were forced to clean the wreckage, digging through ashes for twisted remains. Glenn's hatred burned just as bright, but beneath it flickered confusion. Was this what revenge looked like? Entire cities erased? Children crying in alleys where barracks once stood? He didn't have an answer, only the hollow satisfaction that his captors were finally suffering too. The Japanese officers, desperate and humiliated, grew erratic. Rumors spread that the Americans were preparing to invade the home islands. Some guards spoke of honorable suicide if defeat came. Others muttered about new weapons that could destroy entire cities in one blast, a whisper that would soon prove real. Imperial Army Intelligence Bulletin, July 1945. In the midst of this unraveling empire, Glenn Fraser's revenge plan had transformed from an act of fury to a test of endurance. Every day alive was another act of defiance. Every sunrise was a victory Japan could not take away. But even as the empire trembled, one final shock awaited both captors and captives, a force so sudden and absolute that it would end not only the war, but the very idea of vengeance itself. And when it came, the boy who had sworn to live long enough to see revenge would discover something far greater and far heavier than victory. The end came with a silence that sounded like a verdict. On August 9, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck by detonations that erased neighborhoods, factories, and entire families. The second blast at Nagasaki convinced Japan's War Council that continuation was futile. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For prisoners like Glenn Fraser, the surrender on August 15 was not an instant balm. It was the slow unwinding of 4 years of torment, a release threaded with guilt and triumph. Strategically, the atomic strikes accelerated capitulation and prevented an Allied invasion that planners calculated would cost casualties. Manhattan Project After Action Report, 1946. Numbers tell part of the story, but not the human ledger. For every factory reduced to rubble, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki Aircraft, Hitachi, there were engineers, foundrymen, and assembly line hands who had kept machines moving and who now lay beneath the ash. For Glenn, revenge arrived as an impersonal force. B-29 formations, waves of incendiaries that turned wooden districts into firestorms, and Allied submarines that severed shipping lanes. Post-war interrogations and logistical studies point to 3 decisive strains: the attrition of Japan's merchant fleet, the systematic destruction of urban industry by sustained bombing, and acute shortages of fuel and steel that throttled production. Together, these factors corroded Japan's capacity for modern warfare. The U.S. Naval Intelligence Debrief, 1946. The psychological toll cut both ways. Allied bomber crews returned home with medals and nightmares. In debriefings, they described entire districts consumed and the faces of children among the ash. Japanese civilians carried those images as living scars. Surveys and reports compiled after 1945 recorded a strange hollow in triumph, pride braided with sorrow, and a persistent moral unease among those who had delivered the blows. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Less often told is the quiet labor of craftsmen and technicians, whose steady hands sustained the material edge. Field mechanics at forward bases nursed worn Wright R-3350 engines through chronic overheating. Engineers at Wright Aeronautical redesigned oil coolers and supervised field modifications that reduced catastrophic failures. Radar teams at the Radiation Laboratory refined centimetric sets that improved target acquisition and bombing accuracy. Production managers in Detroit and shipwrights in Seattle coordinated shifts to replace losses and keep fleets supplied. Credit belongs as much to these engineers and foremen as to the generals who directed strategy. Office of Scientific Research Records, 1944. On the Japanese side, foremen and repair crews exhibited prodigious improvisation. Cannibalized parts kept fighters flying. Small workshops rewired engines, retempered gears, and stitched armor from scrap metal. They fought not only enemy bombs but systemic scarcity, coal shortages, collapsed mines, and severed shipping lanes that denied fuel and ore. The result was grinding attrition. Doctrine, courage, and tactical skill could not overcome the absence of replacement parts and raw material. Imperial Shipyards Log, 1945. Those twin industrial narratives reshaped doctrine. In the immediate post-war years, Allied planners recalibrated strategy around production, logistics, and the capacity to deliver strategic strikes. NATO's logistics networks, the Marshall Plan's emphasis on industrial recovery, and Cold War mobilization pathways are direct descendants of lessons learned in 1944 and 1945. Firepower without industrial depth is brittle. Logistical resilience is decisive. War Production Board After Action, 1946. The human consequences demanded institutional response. Allied governments expanded veteran care, funded medical research into combat trauma, and built reintegration programs for former prisoners. Japan's occupation and demilitarization repurposed arsenals into civilian factories. Engineers were retrained to rebuild railways, bridges, and hospitals. Universities shifted research priorities from ordnance to medicine and infrastructure. These transitions were slow and essential to stabilizing societies. Reconstruction Administration Records, 1947. Glenn Fraser's arc mirrors these broader currents. He returned home with hatred raw, and the image of a strafed hospital pressed into his memory. For years, his only certainty was the vow to see retribution. In public testimony, he described the death march, the 5x5 pit of solitary confinement, and the friends who never finished the road. Over decades, he chose a different public path. He confessed that when retribution arrived, it tasted of ash and sorrow. His later message emphasized reconciliation and remembrance rather than cycles of revenge. Memory, he argued, should instruct rather than inflame. Historians continue to debate the military necessity and moral justification for strategic bombing and atomic use. Archival memoranda reveal planners balancing casualty projections from a planned invasion against immediate destruction. Other scholars emphasize alternatives never pursued and the civilian suffering that followed. Joint Chiefs Memoranda, 1945. The debate endures because technical calculations carry moral consequences. Modern warfare amplifies suffering even as it can shorten campaigns. For modern technologists and military planners, the lesson is stark. Scale and speed remain decisive. Industrial capacity, logistics, and precision strike determine outcomes, but these are blunt instruments without ethical frameworks, legal constraint, and systems of care for combatants and civilians alike. The trajectory from wartime assembly lines to Cold War arsenals and into today's network systems is direct. Production and logistics shape capability. Societal choices govern the use of force. Defense Doctrine Papers, 1990s. Behind every strategic result were thousands of skilled hands. Foundrymen altered alloy recipes when nickel was scarce. Shipwrights patched hulls by lamplight during blackouts. Radio operators maintained fragile links across thousands of miles so bomber streams could rendezvous. Production planners rerouted parts and rewired schedules on factory floors. Credit belongs to Vannevar Bush, Wright Aeronautical Engineers, and the anonymous crews in Detroit, Dayton, Kure, and Yokohama, whose problem-solving turned scarcity into survival. The final uncomfortable truth of Glenn's story is simple. He had planned revenge for 4 years. When it arrived as a rain of fire and blockade, he discovered that the payment was higher than his hatred. That paradox, victory that wounds the victor, retribution that scars the soul, remains the era's clearest lesson. Industrial might can raise cities and armies, but only memory, law, and empathy can rebuild a peace worth having.